Hello, everyone, and welcome to Liam's Lyceum. And I wanted to talk about something I'm not scripted. I don't even have any notes for this, but I wanted to talk about a book about the Holocaust, written from the point of view of a Holocaust victim, a survivor in this case. And I mean, I've read books like Diary of a Young Girl, Night, Man's Search for Meaning. Those are all wonderful books, and you should read them. And I don't want to take away from those books at all. That's not what the point of this is. It is to add to that, and that is to really just mention a book that I think is also worthwhile and is really not popular. I think I looked and it had like maybe 2 or 3 reviews on Goodreads, and it has maybe 14 ratings on Goodreads. There are a bit more reviews on Amazon. That is The Narrow Bridge Beyond the Holocaust by Isaac Neuman. Also, there's a co author here, Michael Palencia Roth. This is published by the University of Illinois Press, which is probably why it's not that popular. It's a university press. Not a lot of books that I know of from university presses are really popping in popularity. Um, but this is not a very long book. And it is a book actually I read almost 3 years ago. So I have not even read this recently. I've gone through it a bit recently, but not I haven't read the whole thing. And I have read the whole thing though in the past, and I should say that I think about this book a lot. Um, I find it to be very poignant, and I found it to be very different in a lot of ways than the books from Holocaust victims that I am familiar with. Essentially, Isaac Newman later in life is a rabbi, but during the Holocaust he was rather young. I believe he was born in 1923, and so he is a teenager when he gets put into this ghetto with his family, and he ends up getting shipped off to several concentration camps, either 5 or 6, with his brother Yosel, if I'm remembering correctly. And essentially, throughout the Holocaust, every single one of his family members sadly dies, with the exception of his elder brother, who, right at the beginning of the war, flees to the Soviet Union. Right, and that brother really doesn't come up in this book at all because he wasn't there. It's mostly about, well, it's actually, I don't even say mostly, because this book is a little less than 200 pages, and the concentration camp stuff doesn't even really happen until about page 100. So what I think it's mostly about actually is faith in God, right? The love of Talmud and his people. It's the love of his upbringing, of his teacher, right? That we hear a lot about his teacher, um, uh, as he's younger, and in fact, that's a lot of what the opening of the book is. We do have a little preface about how he had heart surgery, and that inspired him to write about this stuff that he didn't really like to talk about, this experience in the Holocaust. Um, and But it also, during that experience where he remembers, he heard a song with this prayer, this morning prayer, Modayani Lefanechu is how it starts. In My goodness, I'm forgetting what it's called right now. It's not Hebrew. um, but so essentially he has this reminder of this prayer he used to say every morning that his family, he would awake listening to, right? um, and that reminded him of his childhood, essentially. Oh, Yiddish, sorry, that I remember now, Yiddish. And so that's essentially actually what a big focus of the book is on. Yes, it is his religion, his Hasidic customs. He grew up in Poland. Okay, mine. That is important. He grew up in a town called Zdanska Wola, um, which is near Lodz. I don't actually know how to say Lodz, but Zdanska Wola. Here's a map. Um, and Zdanska Wola is a city. It's not a town. There's about 28,000 people, for example, is what he says is in there. It's made up of Jews, Poles, and Germans. And the largest ethnic group was actually the Jews. There's about 10,000, what he says. I've seen in other sources, it was about 8,000 before World War II broke out. And essentially, he has this experience like growing up before the war, and it's a strong sense of community. It's a strong sense of culture. Um, and what becomes evidence is, besides the fact that it is slowly gets dismantled, right, as he finds people who make bad decisions, right, these characters that are real people, right, and there's people who make um, very marvelous and sacrificing decisions. throughout his life, and many of them who end up dying, of course, right, uh, at the hands of the Germans in most cases, obviously. And it is a very heartbreaking story at times, as you could probably imagine. But that key thing about the loss of his the loss of his culture, that it just doesn't exist anymore. Like he returns to Zadanska Vola afterwards, um, and also the loss of his family, but also the perseverance of his faith, essentially, are pretty important. And in fact, in the preface, though, at the end, near the end, he says, the book that follows is an attempt to restore the silent song of my vanished world." Um, and that is, I think, effective, honestly. So again, we get a little bit of his childhood. Um, Reb Mendel, his teacher, essentially, and then we get in the ghetto. We get some stuff in the ghetto about like Hanukkah, for example, and then Shlomo, this person that was very important in his life, and then we get part 3 in the camps, um, which focuses a lot on his brother Yosel. Unfortunately, I think I have it marked in here at some point. Yes, okay. Hans Bubo, who I believe was executed after the war for his crimes, personally supervised what happened next. He issued a command that all the Jews from the ghetto go to the cemetery. Here, the details about my family become vague, because at this point, Yosel and Isaac are, I believe, in a factory waiting to get shipped off to the camps, separated from their family. I know that my father, mother, and sisters were still in Zadanska Vola, so they must have gone to the cemetery along with everyone else. At the cemetery gate, eyewitnesses say old people were separated from their families and children, from their parents, and then put into trucks and taken away. My 4 younger sisters were probably torn from my parents and my 2 older sisters at this point. My family and all Zadanska Vola's remaining Jews spent the night in the cemetery, guarded by fully armed soldiers. Close to 3,000 people greeted the dawn the next morning. The order then came down from Bibo. Again, I don't know how to say his name. I apologize. Kill all but 1,200. I have wondered about the precision of that figure. Was it to be attributed to the German bureaucratic obsession with the detail? Was it the limit that the transport train could take in time allotted? Was it all that the ghetto and loads could accommodate? I don't know if my family survived that massacre, but I do know that Dr. Lemberg, his wife, and his daughter did. At noon that day, the Gestapo hunted Dr. Lemberg down in a cemetery and took him to see Bibo. And then there's a story about Dr. Lemberg here, but I don't need to go into that right now. What's unfortunate is that we do know, yes, that we don't know how all of his family died, but we do know that they did die. Assumingly, most of them shortly after the separation, right? That several hundred died in the cemetery that night, potentially some or all of his family, and that most of them, even most of those Jews that were taken out from Zagadan were then taken to camps and immediately gassed, several thousand of them. And so that even if they did survive the cemetery, they probably did not survive much beyond that. Then we get later in the book, he keeps on getting moved from camp to camp, and he remembers a guy who gave him his jacket. He knew he was dying, so he asked Isaac to remember him, and how close to death that Isaac himself became, but then how Yosel, his hand gets injured and it would not heal, and they were afraid that they needed Yosel's going to die essentially if he doesn't get the aid he needs. But the only aid available to him is the aid available to Jews in a concentration camp, and so not very good. Of course, in fact, that is their worry, is that going to the clinic would actually mean death. And so essentially what they do is they both go and say they have different complaints, right? That like Isaac is just like got a sore back or something, right? And they tell him to come back the next day and it wouldn't be a big deal. But to counteract potentiality of his brother Yosel's infected hand getting him killed, they switch places. And so Yosel, when Isaac's name is called, Yosel goes in instead. and because Isaac got in line first, right? So he gets his name called first, and Yosel goes in instead, and because he knew that there was going to be a death sentence for him, essentially. It says Yosel took another and higher number and waited, and then just before my number was called, Yosel exchanged places with me. Before crossing the threshold into the clinic, Yosel paused and turned around. His eye caught mine. He nodded and disappeared. He never came out. The clinic registry for Mauthausen on that day reads Isaac Neuman died on March 21st, 1945. Cause unknown. Yosel carried my name with him into death. Part of me died with him. I saw little point in living anymore. And when I read this, the part of me died with him. And the name of these chapters are My Brother's Keeper as well. And Yosel, his younger brother, he says, my younger brother and my keeper Yosel, at the very end here. So this is in some sense the legacy of Isaac, just remembering that remembering his family and all the other people he met. We do get a little bit about his experience after the war. That happened very near the end of the war, of course, March 1945, in Mauthausen, and some of his experience after the war, of course, like I said. And he does mention near the end here, that says, I had to accept that except for my older brother, Fischel, who had fled to the Soviet Union during the early weeks of the war, all had been killed. Talking about his family and his friends. In fact, unfortunately, I saw a statistic somewhere. So actually, let me read this first. But he goes back to Sadanska Vola, which I think he'd only been back to once or so after the war, and in this several years in 1994. Says, I was not surprised by what we saw. All signs of Judaism were gone from the streets, the buildings, and the town. Gone was our steeple, and the main synagogue, the Bais Midrash, and gone the plaza between them. Gone the mikveh of the community, the marketplace, and Old Town. And so everything's gone, right? Essentially, that is not just his family, his entire existence, his entire sense of culture is wiped out. It doesn't come back after the war, even decades after the war. I've seen a statistic actually that of those 10,000 or 8,000, depending on what that number is, or even up to 11,000 for how many Jews are put into the Sadanska Vola ghetto, that after the Holocaust, after the war, only 60 survived. And to me, that is just astounding. I cannot comprehend. But that's the book essentially, and I mean, I don't think that spoils anything just about this life, obviously. But on a personal note, the reason I wanted to read this, the reason why I know this exists, actually, I grew up in this area. Actually, I grew up in Champaign-Urbana area, at least, and when I was a child, when I was rather young, I went to the synagogue that Isaac Neuman was the rabbi for, the Mount Sinai Temple, and it served a bunch of different sects of Judaism. We were Reform. I'm not ethnically Jewish at all, but he was emeritus. He was the emeritus rabbi at this point. He retired in the 80s, but it was always just to me that that made sense in a sense for me to read someone from this old spiritual leader, in a sense, even though I'm not Jewish anymore. I was, I do remember essentially what I would call baptism, being baptized in a mikveh, and like he mentions a mikveh there, and so in a sense there was that personal connection that I wanted to read this, right, and it is, I don't know, it is very hard to read this stuff, but at the same time, it is also a very good reminder. In some sense, I don't want to read it too much because I don't want to become humans shouldn't be used to stuff like that, right? In a sense, but it also should be reminded of stuff like that. There's a point in here later in the book, actually, where he talks about that we shouldn't let evil flourish when we see stuff like this, right? Like he didn't want that to happen again, right? Which was, in a sense, actually, I think him talking about his experience protesting the Vietnam War, also later in marching, I believe in Birmingham, actually, when he was a rabbi down in Alabama with Martin Luther King Jr. But Anyways, so again, recommend. Again, I don't want to not recommend any of the other ones, any famous books from victims, which again I do recommend those. But thought I mentioned one that is really not that popular at all. The Narrow Bridge Beyond Holocaust by Isaac Newman. Anyways, Lean from Williams Lyson. I'll catch you next time.